Murder at the Village Tea Room, a Miss Marple mystery. Dear listeners, welcome back to Tea Time Mysteries. I'm your host Henry, and I'm glad you're here. Wherever you're listening from across Asia, these cosy Miss Marple mysteries bring us together. Tonight's story was chosen by our community. Thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Now, pour your tea and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Widow Who Smiled at Tea. The village of St. Briarwood in the Meadows prided itself on its calm. It lay cupped between hedgerows and rolling fields like something preserved in amber, unchanged, respectable, and faintly smug about both facts. Even the clock seemed to tick more quietly there, as if aware that loudness of any sort was considered bad form. On the afternoon of the Hawthorn fete, the village was at its most carefully arranged. White trestle tables dotted the green. Jam jars brimming with late summer flowers lined the paths. There were cakes iced to perfection, raffle tickets sold with earnest smiles, and the polite murmur of gossip disguised as concern. Miss Jane Marple, seated beneath a pale blue parasol, observed it all while knitting a pair of socks that had already grown long enough to suggest a person with particularly cold calves. She nodded occasionally at passers-by, her expression mild, her eyes pale, clear, and remarkably attentive, taking in everything. It was generally agreed that the fete was being held for Mrs. Elspeth Hawthorn, though whether it was truly in her honour was a more debatable matter. Mrs. Hawthorn sat at the head table, her back straight, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore black, of course, but not the dull, wilted black of fresh mourning. This was fine crepe, well cut, with a faint sheen when the sun touched it. Her hat was pinned at a precise angle, adorned with a single jet brooch. She was smiling, not broadly, not foolishly, but pleasantly, cordially, as though she were hosting a luncheon rather than attending a fete held barely 6 weeks after her husband's death. "That," murmured Mrs. Lavender Pritchard, leaning toward her neighbour, "is what I find most unsettling." Her neighbour, Miss Gwen Alder, pursed her lips. Grief affects people differently. "Yes, well," Mrs. Pritchard replied, "I've known grief. I've never smiled through it." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. She did not look up, but her ears, sharp as ever, missed nothing. The late Mr. Arthur Hawthorn had been, by all public accounts, a generous benefactor to the village. He funded the church roof, sponsored the cricket club, and donated discreetly but frequently to charitable causes. He had also been, according to several less public accounts, difficult, particular, not unkind precisely, but firm in ways that left bruises invisible to the eye. His death had been ruled natural, a sudden collapse at home. His heart, said the doctor, had simply given out. Yet the village had not quite accepted that explanation. Villages rarely did. Mrs. Hawthorn rose gracefully as the vicar cleared his throat to make a small speech. She inclined her head modestly as he spoke of remembrance, community, and the enduring strength of St. Briarwood. When polite applause followed, she accepted it with a faint dip of her chin. Miss Marple noticed two things then. First, Mrs. Hawthorn did not glance once at the oak tree near the edge of the green, beneath which a small plaque had been placed in Arthur Hawthorn's memory. Second, when applause ended, she exhaled, not shakily, not with grief, but with something that sounded very much like relief. "Funny thing," Miss Marple murmured to Mrs. Bantry, who had just joined her with a paper cup of tea. "How people reveal themselves when they think everyone is looking in the same direction." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "Oh, Jane, you always say the oddest things." Miss Marple smiled sweetly and returned to her knitting. The fete continued. Children ran shrieking between stalls. The tombola attracted fierce competition. Inspector Harold Keene, visiting his aunt in the village, wandered about politely, accepted a slice of Victoria sponge, and listened with professional patience to unsolicited theories about Arthur Hawthorn's demise. "He was poisoned, mark my words," said one. "Heart trouble runs in families," said another. "I always thought she was too quiet," said a third, nodding meaningfully toward Mrs. Hawthorn. Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Hawthorn accepted a teacup from Diana Hawthorn, her stepdaughter. The younger woman's smile was brittle. Her fingers lingered too long on the saucer before she let go. "Careful," Mrs. Hawthorn said lightly. "It's hot." There was nothing remarkable in the words themselves, only in the way Diana stiffened, her jaw tightening before she managed to reply. "I know," she said. Miss Marple paused in her knitting. The afternoon wore on. Clouds drifted lazily overhead. Somewhere near the cake stall, raised voices erupted briefly. Mr. Lionel Drew, Arthur Hawthorne's former business partner, gesturing sharply before being ushered away by the vicar. By 4:30, the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong came not as a scream, but as silence. Mrs. Hawthorne had been speaking with the vicar one moment. The next she swayed. Someone laughed nervously, assuming theatrics. Then she fell. Her body struck the grass with a sound far too solid to be pretense. Teacups shattered. Chairs scraped. A scream finally came. Thin, sharp, unmistakably real. Inspector Keene was at her side almost at once. He knelt, felt for a pulse, and looked up slowly. "I'm afraid," he said, "she's dead." The village seemed to inhale as one. Miss Marple did not move. She watched the faces instead. Shock, yes. Alarm. A certain avid curiosity. And on Diana Hawthorne's face something else entirely. Gone almost as soon as it appeared. Not grief, not relief, but fear. As the inspector began issuing instructions and the fete dissolved into murmurs and tears, Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully into her bag. "So sad," she said gently. "So very sad." Yet her eyes rested once more on the oak tree, the plaque gleaming softly in the late sun. 2 deaths in 6 weeks, she thought. And one widow who never mourned. The pattern, Miss Marple knew, had just begun to reveal itself. Chapter 2. Murmurs After the Fete. By early evening, St. Briarwood in the Meadows had transformed from a place of bunting and benevolence into one of shuttered windows and lowered voices. The green lay abandoned now, save for the faint impressions of chairs pressed into grass and the darkened patch where Mrs. Elspeth Hawthorne had fallen. Someone, out of kindness or superstition, had laid a cardigan over the place, as though modesty were still required. The villagers dispersed in clusters, drawing together in kitchens and parlours, where kettles boiled and biscuits were offered without appetite. News travelled quickly but not accurately. By the time the sun slipped behind the hedgerows, there were already 3 versions of how Mrs. Hawthorne had died, 2 explanations for why, and at least one confident assertion that everyone should have seen it coming. Inspector Harold Keene established a temporary command at Hawthorne House, a solid red brick residence at the edge of the village. It had once been admired for its symmetry and order. Tonight it seemed watchful, its windows dark, its gravel drive crunching ominously beneath hurried footsteps. Miss Marple arrived quietly, escorted by Mrs. Bantry, who believed, correctly, that such occasions required both propriety and witnesses. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish, and something sharper beneath it, like medicine or bitter herbs. Diana Hawthorne sat rigidly in the drawing-room, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had blanched. Opposite her, Lionel Drew paced, running a hand through thinning hair that had once been neatly combed. "This is madness," he said for the 3rd time. "Absolute madness." Inspector Keene looked up from his notebook. "Madness doesn't usually kill people, Mr. Drew," Drew flushed. "You know what I mean. First Arthur, now Elspeth." "Your former partner and his widow," the inspector supplied mildly. Drew stopped pacing. "I cared for them." Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the window, observed that he did not say loved. The doctor's preliminary assessment had already raised eyebrows. Mrs. Hawthorne, like her husband before her, appeared to have suffered sudden cardiac failure. Yet the coincidence sat uneasily with everyone present, including the inspector. 2 sudden deaths, Mrs. Bantry whispered to Miss Marple, and both perfectly healthy beforehand. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Perfectly healthy people do sometimes die suddenly, but not usually in quite the same way, so very close together." Across the room, Diana Hawthorne spoke at last. "She wasn't ill," she said. "Elspeth, I mean. She had headaches, perhaps, but nothing more." Inspector Keene looked up. "Did she take medication?" "Yes, tinctures, herbal remedies." Diana hesitated. "She preferred natural things." Miss Marple's needles clicked once before stopping entirely. "How very sensible of her," Miss Marple remarked mildly. "My cousin, you know, swore by foxglove tea. Quite a remarkable plant." Inspector Keene glanced at her sharply. "Indeed." "Oh yes, of course one must be very careful with it." The inspector made a note. The first accusation came before nightfall. Mrs. Lavender Pritchard, fortified by sherry and righteous certainty, announced to a gathered audience at the post office that Diana Hawthorne must have done it. She stood to gain everything, Mrs. Pritchard insisted. The house, the money, the lot, and she never liked her stepmother. Others nodded, some hesitated. She looked terrified, said Miss Gwenalder quietly, not guilty. Guilt comes in many forms, Mrs. Pritchard replied darkly. By 9 o'clock, suspicion had spread to include Lionel Drew, the vicar, who had argued publicly with Arthur Hawthorne weeks before his death, and, spoken only in whispers, Mrs. Hawthorne herself. Perhaps she killed him, someone said, and then fate caught up with her. Miss Marple listened from her armchair, a cup of tea cooling untouched at her side. People do like neat solutions, she said gently. They save one the trouble of thinking. At Hawthorne House, the inspector continued his work. He questioned the staff, Mrs. Keats, the housekeeper, and Thomas the gardener. Both insisted that Mrs. Hawthorne had been calm in recent days, almost cheerful. She laughed this morning, Mrs. Keats said uncertainly. I remember because it struck me as odd. Odd? The inspector prompted. Well, Mr. Hawthorne's things were still about. His study untouched. Most widows— She broke off, uncomfortable. Inspector Keene nodded. Thank you. When he stepped outside, Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance. Inspector, she said pleasantly, may I ask you something? He smiled a little wearily. You already have, Miss Marple. Of course, she agreed. It's just, have you noticed how grief affects people differently? He raised an eyebrow. I've noticed that people say that when they're trying to excuse odd behaviour. Oh no, Miss Marple said. I mean quite the opposite. People often say it to explain things that are in fact quite consistent. Consistent with what? Human nature. She did not elaborate. Late that night, as rain began to patter softly against windows, Inspector Keene reviewed his notes. 2 deaths, similar symptoms, herbal remedies. Tension within the household, financial motives aplenty. Yet something troubled him. Mrs. Hawthorne's teacup, collected from the fete, had not been at her place for long. She had accepted it moments before collapsing, and yet several others had drunk from the same pot without incident, unless, of course, the danger had not been in the tea at all. In her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and stood by the window, watching the rain soak into the dark earth. Patterns, she murmured. Always patterns. She thought of the oak tree, of relief mistaken for composure, of fear mistaken for guilt, and of a widow who had smiled, right up until the moment she fell. Somewhere in St. Briarwood the truth lay waiting, and Miss Marple, as ever, was content to let it believe itself safe, for now. Chapter 3. The Shape of Ordinary Lies. Morning returned to St. Briarwood in the meadows with deceptive gentleness. Sunlight spilled across hedgerows washed clean by rain, birds sang with the confidence of creatures untouched by scandal, and the village shop opened precisely on time. To an outsider nothing had changed. To those who lived there, everything had. Miss Marple woke early, as she always did, and brewed her tea with care. She sat at the small table by the window, buttered her toast neatly, and read the Daily Chronicle without absorbing a word. Her mind, instead, arranged impressions like buttons in a sewing box, sorting, comparing, discarding. After breakfast she put on her hat and gloves and stepped out. The village responded to her presence as it always had, with smiles that assumed harmlessness. Miss Marple was greeted warmly, invited in readily, and told far more than anyone intended. At the butcher's, Mrs. Keats stood whispering to Mrs. Lavender Pritchard. I heard the inspector sealed off the study, Mrs. Pritchard said. Arthur Hawthorne's study. Well, he spent half his life in there, Mrs. Keats replied. Accounts, letters, secrets, if you ask me. Miss Marple examined a cut of lamb thoughtfully. Men who keep careful accounts rarely keep careful consciences, she said mildly. Both women turned to her. Oh, Miss Marple, Mrs. Pritchard said, lowering her voice. Do you think it was poison? I think, Miss Marple replied, that poison is often chosen by people who prefer not to be seen. At the chemist's, Miss Marple lingered over shelves of tinctures and tonics. She asked polite questions, purchased a small vial of lavender oil, and observed the young assistant's discomfort when she mentioned foxglove again. We don't sell that, he said quickly, not without a prescription. Quite right, Miss Marple said. People are often careless with what they call natural. By mid-morning she arrived, by invitation, at Hawthorne House. Inspector Keene had not intended to allow visitors, but Miss Marple's presence seemed inevitable, like the ticking of a clock one forgot to silence. Diana Hawthorne sat in the morning room, pale but composed. She stood when Miss Marple entered. "I'm glad you came," Diana said. "You were kind. Yesterday." "Kindness is usually just attention," Miss Marple replied. "People notice when one offers it." Diana's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Almost. They spoke of trivial things at first: the weather, the roses along the drive, Arthur Hawthorne's fondness for order. Only gradually did the conversation shift. "She changed after he died," Diana said at last. "Elspeth, I mean." "In what way?" "She seemed lighter." Diana hesitated. "I thought it indecent. Now I'm not sure." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Some people feel relief when a long strain ends." "It wasn't long," Diana said sharply. "He was difficult, but not cruel." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Those are not the same thing." Diana looked away. Inspector Keene entered then, carrying a thin folder. "Miss Marple," he said, "you have impeccable timing." "Oh, I've always found that," she replied. "People are usually most honest when they think they're nearly finished speaking." He gestured toward the study. "We've found something you might find interesting." Arthur Hawthorne's study smelled of leather and dust. Papers were stacked with methodical precision. The desk blotter was clean. Too clean. Inspector Keene opened a drawer and withdrew a small notebook. "Personal ledger," he said, "not financial. This," he tapped it. "Details arrangements made quietly over the years. Payments, settlements." "Blackmail?" Diana asked. "Compensation," the inspector corrected. "At least that's how Mr. Hawthorne framed it." Miss Marple glanced through the entries. "Ah," she said softly, "how very tidy." "Several names here belong to villagers," the inspector continued. "People who had misunderstandings with Mr. Hawthorne, including Lionel Drew." "Lionel had reason to hate him," Diana said. "Arthur pushed him out of the business." "True," said the inspector. "But hate does not always lead to murder." Miss Marple closed the notebook. "No, more often it leads to mistakes." That afternoon, Lionel Drew was brought in for questioning. He arrived flushed and indignant. "I had nothing to do with Elspeth's death," he said, "or Arthur's." "Your name appears in his ledger," Inspector Keene said. Drew scoffed. Arthur liked control. He paid people to keep quiet. "About what?" Miss Marple asked gently. Drew hesitated. "Things that didn't concern Elspeth." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "They always do, eventually." As Drew left, his composure visibly shaken, the inspector leaned back in his chair. "He's hiding something," Keene said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but not murder." "How can you be sure?" Miss Marple considered. "People who kill tend to simplify their stories. Mr. Drew complicates his." The first real crack in the case appeared just before dusk. Mrs. Keats, the housekeeper, came forward trembling. "I found something," she said, "in Mrs. Hawthorne's room." The inspector followed her upstairs. In a small cabinet beside the bed, wrapped carefully in cloth, lay several dried leaves. The doctor examined them later. "Foxglove," he confirmed. "Digitalis." Inspector Keene exhaled slowly. "So she poisoned herself?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Foxglove is rarely chosen by those who wish to die," she said. "It's too uncertain, too slow." "Then she poisoned Arthur," the inspector said, "and someone poisoned her." "Or," Miss Marple suggested, "someone ensured that she continued a habit she did not fully understand." Night fell again over St. Briarwood, heavier this time. Miss Marple returned home. Her thoughts arranged more clearly now. One death explained another. Relief explained smiles. Fear explained silence. But there remained one thing that troubled her. Mrs. Hawthorne had been careful. Too careful. And careful people, Miss Marple knew, rarely make the same mistake twice, unless someone else is guiding their hand. The pattern was forming, and soon someone would notice that Miss Marple was watching. Chapter 4. The Dangerous Comfort of Certainty. By the fourth day after the Hawthorne fate, St. Briarwood in the Meadows had settled into a mood of grim assurance. Certainty, even when ill-founded, was a comfort. It allowed people to return to habits, to cups of tea taken at the proper hour, to conversations that did not always circle back to death. Inspector Keene, however, had learned long ago that certainty arrived too early only when truth had not yet been invited into the room. The prevailing belief, spoken cautiously but widely, was that Mrs. Elspeth Hawthorne had poisoned her husband and paid for it with her own life. The foxglove leaves discovered in her bedside cabinet had proved irresistible to the village imagination. It was neat, moral, satisfying. "She got away with it once," Mrs. Lavender Pritchard said firmly in the post office, "but conscience caught up with her." Miss Marple, waiting patiently for her stamps, said nothing. She merely observed that Mrs. Pritchard spoke with the unmistakable relief of someone who believed the matter finished. At Hawthorne House, Diana Hawthorne endured the certainty with visible strain. "I don't believe it," she said to Inspector Keene. "Elspeth wasn't reckless. If she'd poisoned Arthur, she wouldn't have kept the evidence beside her bed." "Unless she wished to be found out," the inspector suggested. Diana shook her head. She wanted control. Being exposed was the one thing she feared. Miss Marple, seated nearby with her knitting, looked up. "Control is often mistaken for confidence," she said gently, "but it usually grows from fear." The inspector studied her. "Fear of what, Miss Marple?" "Of being powerless," she replied, "of having one's choices narrowed." That afternoon, the doctor's full report arrived. Both Arthur and Elspeth Hawthorne, he confirmed, had died from cardiac failure induced by digitalis toxicity. The dosage in Arthur's case had been low, cumulative, administered over time. Elspeth's had been higher. Acute. "An accident, then?" Inspector Keene asked. The doctor hesitated. "Digitalis is unforgiving. A small increase can be fatal." Miss Marple's needles paused. "How unfortunate," she murmured, "for someone who'd been taking it safely for some time." The inspector's gaze sharpened. "You think she didn't miscalculate?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that people who rely on routine rarely change it without reason." The first person to challenge the village's certainty was Mrs. Keats. She came to Miss Marple's cottage just before dusk, wringing her hands. "I can't sleep," she said. "I keep thinking, what if I've said the wrong thing?" Miss Marple poured tea. "What troubles you, Mrs. Keats?" "I told the inspector that Mrs. Hawthorne laughed the morning she died, that she seemed light-hearted." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And," Mrs. Keats swallowed, "she was packing." "Packing?" "A small case. Just a few things." "I thought she was going to London." Miss Marple's eyes lifted. "Did she say that?" "No, but she asked me about trains, and she asked whether Mr. Hawthorne's old papers had been catalogued yet." "Did she seem anxious?" "No," Mrs. Keats said slowly. "Purposeful." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That's rather different." Inspector Keene took the news badly. "So she was planning to leave," he said. "That doesn't fit suicide." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Nor does carelessness." "Unless she was interrupted," he countered. "Possibly," Miss Marple said. "But then we must ask. By whom?" The inspector exhaled sharply. Everyone had motive. Arthur controlled them all. Elspeth benefited from his death. Diana inherits. Lionel resented him. "And yet," Miss Marple said, "only one person benefits from both deaths equally." Inspector Keene looked up. "Who?" Miss Marple returned to her knitting. "Someone who required certainty." That evening, Diana Hawthorne requested to see Miss Marple privately. They sat together in the drawing-room, the lamps casting long shadows across furniture still arranged as Arthur Hawthorne had liked it. "She frightened me," Diana said suddenly. "Elspeth?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes, not after Arthur died. Before. She watched me, asked questions about my father, about money." "Did she accuse you of anything?" "No," Diana said. "She never accused. She implied." Miss Marple nodded. "Implied accusations are far more effective." Diana's voice wavered. "I thought she meant to destroy me." "And did she?" Miss Marple asked softly. Diana hesitated. "No, she died first." The inspector interrupted with news that shifted the case again. Lionel Drew had attempted to leave the village that afternoon and been stopped. "He's frightened," Keene said. "He claims Arthur Hawthorne threatened him shortly before his death." "Threatened?" Miss Marple echoed. "With exposure. Drew had been diverting funds years ago. Arthur found out. Paid him to keep quiet, but the arrangement was deteriorating." "Did Mrs. Hawthorne know?" "She must have," the inspector said. "Her handwriting appears in the later entries." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "So Elspeth had leverage," she said. "And enemies." "Yes," Keene replied. "Which brings us back to her poisoning Arthur." Does it? Miss Marple asked. The inspector frowned. What are you suggesting? That Mrs. Hawthorne believed she was acting alone, Miss Marple said, but she wasn't. Silence followed. You think someone manipulated her, Keene said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Someone who encouraged a habit, adjusted a measure, and then, at precisely the wrong moment, allowed her to err. That's speculation. So is suicide, Miss Marple said gently. The turning point came late that night. Inspector Keene received a call from the chemist. A ledger had been reviewed. Someone, not Mrs. Hawthorne, had been purchasing foxglove tincture in small quantities over the past year. The name recorded was D. Hawthorne. Diana Hawthorne sat very still when confronted. That's impossible, she said. I never bought it. Someone signed your name, Keene replied. Someone who knew your habits. Miss Marple watched Diana carefully. There was shock, hurt, anger, but not guilt. No, Miss Marple said quietly. That signature belongs to someone who wanted Diana suspected. Inspector Keene turned to her sharply. You're certain? Yes, Miss Marple replied, because whoever did this needed Diana frightened, but not arrested. Fear makes people predictable. The inspector leaned back, rubbing his temples. So who wanted control, certainty, and a frightened heiress? Miss Marple folded her knitting. Someone who has been underestimated, she said, and who understands better than most how poison works when people trust you. Outside, the village slept uneasily, and somewhere among its tidy houses the true killer began to realize that Miss Marple was no longer merely listening. She was closing in. Chapter 5. The Quiet Ones Who Watch. St. Briarwood in the Meadows had always been fond of certainty, but now it craved resolution. The presence of suspicion, once titillating, had grown uncomfortable. People lowered their voices when passing Hawthorne House. Children were warned not to play near it. Even the postman hesitated at the gate, as though death itself might still be lingering among the roses. Inspector Keene spent the morning re-examining what he had dismissed too quickly. The chemist's ledger lay open before him, the name D. Hawthorne written in a neat looping hand. Not Diana's hand. He knew that now. Diana wrote sharply, decisively, her letters pressed hard into the page. This hand was careful, imitative. Someone practiced, he muttered. Miss Marple, seated opposite him with a cup of tea she had barely touched, nodded. People often do, she said, especially those who spend their lives observing rather than acting. Keene glanced at her. You're thinking of someone specific? I'm thinking, Miss Marple replied, of the people who move about unnoticed, those who hear everything because no one believes they matter. At Hawthorne House, Mrs. Keats the housekeeper had been there for nearly 20 years. She knew the rhythms of the household intimately, who rose early, who took tea where, who trusted whom. She also knew how to prepare Mrs. Hawthorne's nightly herbal draught. She insisted on making it herself, Mrs. Keats said when questioned, but she asked me to lay out the ingredients. Did you ever measure them? Inspector Keene asked. No, sir. I only fetched what she asked for. Miss Marple's eyes rested kindly on the older woman. Did the amounts ever change? She asked. Mrs. Keats hesitated. Not that I noticed. People rarely notice what changes gradually, Miss Marple said. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Thomas the gardener. He was trimming hedges behind Hawthorne House, his movements methodical, almost soothing. Good afternoon, Thomas, Miss Marple said. You keep everything so neat. It's my job, he replied, touching his cap. Yes, Miss Marple said, and you do it very well. Arthur Hawthorne liked things neat, didn't he? Thomas's mouth tightened. He liked control. And Mrs. Hawthorne? She liked peace, Thomas said after a pause. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Peace is a curious thing. People will do extraordinary things to preserve it. Thomas glanced at her, unsettled. You were close to Mrs. Hawthorne, Miss Marple continued. You walked with her in the garden. She asked about plants, he said. She was interested. In foxglove? Miss Marple asked lightly. Thomas's shears paused for just a moment too long. It grows wild near the old wall, he said. Dangerous stuff. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Dangerous when misunderstood. That evening, Inspector Keene gathered everyone still connected to Hawthorne House. The staff, Diana, Lionel Drew, under the pretext of clarifying timelines. Lionel Drew arrived late, pale and sweating. You're wasting time, he snapped. The village already believes Elspeth did it. Villages, Miss Marple said calmly, often believe what allows them to sleep. Diana sat rigid, her eyes darting from face to face. I've been frightened since the day Arthur died, she said suddenly. Not because I thought Elspeth killed him, but because I thought someone wanted her to. The room stilled. Inspector Keene leaned forward. Why? She kept saying she'd put things right. That soon we'd all be free. Miss Marple nodded. Free of Arthur's arrangements? Yes, Diana said. She planned to leave. She told me so the morning she died. Did she say where? Keene asked. No, only that she'd made sure of her safety. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Thomas. Safety, she repeated. A comforting word. The gardener's jaw clenched. That night, Miss Marple lay awake, replaying gestures and silences. Thomas's pause, Mrs. Keats's uncertainty, Lionel Drew's desperation. The murderer, she knew, was not impulsive, nor cruel in the way people expected cruelty to look. They were careful, helpful, present. The breakthrough came with something almost laughably small. Mrs. Bantry, calling the next morning, mentioned it in passing. Funny thing, she said. Mrs. Hawthorne's teacup, the one she collapsed with, wasn't hers. She never used the floral set. Always plain white. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Who usually arranged the cups? She asked. The gardener sometimes helped during fêtes, Mrs. Bantry said, fetching trays from the house. Miss Marple rose at once. Inspector Keene listened grimly as she explained. Thomas didn't poison the tea, he said. The pot was shared. No, Miss Marple agreed, but he controlled which cup Mrs. Hawthorne used. Digitalis can be absorbed through the skin, Keene said slowly. Concentrated extract applied to the handle. Yes, Miss Marple said. A fatal dose, delivered invisibly. Keene stood. We need proof. They found it near the old garden wall. Hidden beneath loose stones was a small bottle, empty now, but with residue enough to confirm its contents. Thomas broke down when confronted. I only meant to frighten her, he said hoarsely. Arthur ruined my family. She promised to expose him. Then she hesitated. So you ensured she didn't, Keene said. And Arthur? Keene asked. Thomas looked up. That was Elspeth. I helped her believe it was safe. Miss Marple watched him sadly. You taught her just enough to be dangerous, she said. And when she no longer served your purpose, you used her habit against her. Thomas was led away in silence. Outside, St. Briarwood stirred. The truth, once quiet and patient, had finally spoken. And Miss Marple, hands folded neatly, reflected, as she always did, that the most dangerous people were not those who raged loudly, but those who waited. Chapter 6. When the obvious is not enough arrest. In a village like St. Briarwood in the meadows was not a single moment but a slow echo. Thomas the gardener was taken away quietly, early in the morning, before the shop opened and before the vicar had finished his prayers. Nevertheless, by 10 o'clock everyone knew. By noon everyone understood, or believed they did. He did it, Mrs. Lavender Pritchard declared with satisfaction. I always say it's the quiet ones. Miss Marple, passing her on the lane, inclined her head politely but said nothing. Certainty, she knew, had returned far too swiftly. Inspector Keene did not share the villagers' relief. He sat in the temporary office he had established in Hawthorne House, reviewing his notes for the 4th time. Thomas's confession was convincing, disturbingly so. Motive, opportunity, method. It all fit with uncomfortable neatness. And yet... You're troubled, Miss Marple observed, setting a plate of biscuits beside him as though he were merely a tired nephew. I don't like how complete it feels, Keene admitted. Cases rarely close themselves so politely. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Politeness is often a performance. Thomas, in custody, had admitted to manipulating Mrs. Hawthorne's herbal routine. He had guided her interest in foxglove, explained its effects carefully, ensured she believed herself knowledgeable. He admitted to placing the concentrated extract on the teacup handle at the fete, but when questioned about Arthur Hawthorne, his answers grew less certain. I didn't poison him, Thomas insisted. She did, Elspeth. And you encouraged her, Keene pressed. Yes, Thomas said, but she chose it. Arthur deserved it. Miss Marple had watched his face then, carefully, quietly. People who encourage murder, she had remarked afterward, usually enjoy claiming it. That afternoon, Diana Hawthorne came to see Miss Marple. She looked exhausted, as though weeks of fear had finally loosened their grip, leaving only emptiness behind. "So it's over," Diana said. "Is it?" Miss Marple asked gently. Diana hesitated. "Thomas confessed." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But confessions are not always endings." Diana frowned. "You think he's lying?" "No," Miss Marple said. "I think he's telling a version of the truth that suits him." Diana sank into a chair. "I don't understand." "Thomas hated Arthur Hawthorne," Miss Marple said. "That is real. He manipulated Elspeth. Also real. But hatred alone does not always lead people to such patience." "Then what does?" "Practice," Miss Marple replied. That word lingered. Inspector Keen's unease deepened when the toxicologist's supplemental report arrived. The digitalis levels in Arthur Hawthorne's system, it confirmed, were consistent with regular ingestion over many months. But the pattern suggested precise measurement, not guesswork. "Elspeth Hawthorne had no medical training," Keen said aloud. "Nor did Thomas," Miss Marple replied. "Someone did," Keen said slowly. The list of people with access to Arthur Hawthorne and his routines was revisited. The doctor, ruled out. The vicar, unlikely. Diana, cleared by both evidence and instinct. Lionel Drew remained. He visited Arthur frequently, Keen said. Business disputes, arguments. "And yet," Miss Marple said, "Mr. Drew is impulsive. His anger shows. You don't believe he could sustain something like this?" "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But he could benefit from it." Keen frowned. "Arthur's death freed him financially." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "But it also placed him at Elspeth's mercy." That evening, Lionel Drew was brought in again. He looked cornered now, his earlier bluster gone. "I didn't kill Arthur," he said immediately, "or Elspeth." "You knew about the foxglove," Keen said. Drew hesitated. "Arthur told me. He said Elspeth was experimenting. He laughed about it." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did he?" "Yes," Drew said. "He thought it harmless. She likes to feel clever," he said. "Did you ever speak to Elspeth about it?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Drew said quickly. Too quickly. Keen leaned forward. "Mr. Drew, Arthur Hawthorne was poisoned gradually. Someone adjusted his dose with care. Thomas claims Elspeth did it alone. But Elspeth was impatient." Drew swallowed. "She hated waiting," Diana murmured from the doorway, having arrived unannounced. Miss Marple nodded. "Impatient people do not commit slow murders." Silence pressed in. Drew's composure finally cracked. "All right," he said hoarsely. "I helped her." Keen straightened. "How?" "She asked questions," Drew said. "About quantities, about effects. I'd dealt with medicines when my wife was ill years ago. I knew enough." Miss Marple watched him steadily. "And when Arthur died?" "Elspeth panicked," Drew said. "She feared exposure. She talked about leaving, about revealing everything." "And that frightened you," Miss Marple said. "Yes," Drew admitted. "She had power over me then." "So you turned Thomas against her," Keen said. Drew's eyes flicked up. "I didn't tell him to kill her." "No," Miss Marple said. "You merely ensured he had reason to." The pieces aligned at last, not in a neat line, but in an ugly, human tangle. Arthur Hawthorne had been poisoned by his wife, yes, but not without guidance. Lionel Drew had taught her precision, encouraged restraint, and ensured dependency. Thomas, in turn, had used Elspeth's fear and habit to end her life, guided not only by revenge, but by whispers carefully placed. "You created a chain," Miss Marple said quietly, "and hoped it would break before it reached you." Drew sagged. "I didn't mean—" "No one ever does," Miss Marple replied. By nightfall, Lionel Drew was arrested as an accessory to murder. The village, learning this, reeled. "But we thought it was finished," Mrs. Lavender Pritchard said faintly. Miss Marple, passing once more beneath the oak tree, paused to look at the plaque. "It rarely is," she murmured. Justice, like truth, was seldom tidy. And still, Miss Marple knew. The final reckoning had not yet arrived. For one question remained unanswered. Why had Elspeth Hawthorne smiled? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, would reveal everything, and it was waiting, quietly, for its moment. Chapter 7. A smile is not always joy. The question lingered in Miss Marple's mind long after the village had decided, once again, that it understood everything. Thomas the gardener and Lionel Drew were now safely contained within the firm boundaries of police certainty. Arthur Hawthorne's murder had been labelled manipulated but deliberate. Elspeth Hawthorne's death, engineered but indirect. The newspapers would like that phrasing. It suggested order. Yet Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting resting idle in her lap, found the explanation unsatisfying. Elspeth Hawthorne's smile would not leave her thoughts. People smiled for many reasons: politeness, cruelty, relief, triumph. Miss Marple had seen all varieties. What she'd seen on Elspeth Hawthorne's face at the fete had not been any of those. It had been anticipation. Inspector Keene arrived that afternoon, his coat damp from an unexpected shower. "You're still troubled," he said, without preamble. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "which usually means I'm right to be." He smiled faintly. "I hoped you'd say that." He sat opposite her, accepting tea without comment. "We've reconstructed the chain," he said. "Drew teaches Elspeth how to poison Arthur slowly. Thomas exploits her fear and kills her. It's ugly. But it works. It explains the deaths," Miss Marple said, "but not the woman." Keene frowned. "What do you mean?" "Elspeth Hawthorne," Miss Marple said, "was not frightened at the end." "She was packing," Keene said. "Mrs. Keats confirmed it." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Packing to leave, which suggests she believed she had won." "Won what?" Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Control," she said. "Freedom, safety." Keene leaned back. "You think she knew Thomas intended to kill her?" "No," Miss Marple said. "I think she believed she was untouchable." That evening Miss Marple requested access to Arthur Hawthorne's study once more. Inspector Keene hesitated only briefly before agreeing. By now he had learned that refusing Miss Marple rarely delayed anything. It merely complicated matters. The study was unchanged, orderly, suffocatingly so. Miss Marple moved slowly, touching nothing at first. She examined the shelves, the desk, the arrangement of papers. Arthur Hawthorne, she suspected, had been a man who believed that control could be achieved by documentation. "People like that," she murmured, "often underestimate imagination." She opened the ledger again. The entries were neat, unemotional, payments made, problems resolved, people contained. And then, near the end, something changed. The final entries were not in Arthur Hawthorne's hand. Inspector Keene saw it too. "Elspeth's writing," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but notice the phrasing." They read together, arrangements concluded, final contingencies in place. "She was tying loose ends," Keene said. "Not quite," Miss Marple replied. "She was documenting victory." The drawer beneath the desk yielded another discovery, a sealed envelope addressed not to a solicitor, nor to Diana, but to Inspector Harold Keene. Keene stared at it. "That wasn't here before." "No," Miss Marple said, "it was hidden. Arthur wouldn't have kept something like this." Keene opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, written in Elspeth Hawthorne's precise hand. "Inspector, if you're reading this, then Arthur is dead, and I am likely to be so as well. You will assume much. I ask that you confirm nothing until you have read the enclosed." The enclosure was a second letter, Arthur Hawthorne's handwriting. Keene read aloud. "Elspeth, if you have found this, then you have already done what I feared you might. I have known for some time that my health has been declining, not naturally, but deliberately. I allowed it. I wanted to see how far you would go." Keene stopped. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The letter continued. "You have always believed yourself clever. You are, but not wise. I have ensured that every step you take binds you more tightly to those you think beneath you. When the time comes, they will not protect you. They will destroy you." Silence filled the room. Arthur Hawthorne had known. He had allowed his own murder, not as surrender, but as control. "He orchestrated it," Keene said hoarsely, "even his own death." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and in doing so, he created a woman who believed herself finally free." Keene looked shaken. "So Elspeth smiled because she believed she had outplayed a tyrant," Miss Marple finished. "She believed the danger was past." "But Arthur's final cruelty," Keene said, "was ensuring she was never safe." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "he taught her how to kill and left her among people who hated her for it. Thomas, Drew, all weapons Arthur Hawthorne had sharpened long before his heart failed." "And her death?" Keene asked. "Still Thomas's doing." Legally, yes, Miss Marple said. Morally, less so. She folded the letters carefully. Elspeth Hawthorne was not innocent, Miss Marple said, but she was also not the master villain everyone imagines. She was a woman who learned too late that power borrowed from cruelty is never truly yours. Keen exhaled slowly. And Arthur Hawthorne? He asked. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Arthur Hawthorne, she said, never stopped controlling anyone, not even in death. The inspector closed the drawer. Outside, church bells began to ring for evening prayer. St. Briarwood would absorb this truth as it absorbed all others, slowly, selectively, imperfectly. As they left the study, Keen glanced at Miss Marple. You know, he said, no jury will ever hear this. No, Miss Marple agreed, but justice does not always require an audience. That night Miss Marple sat once more by her window. She thought of Elspeth Hawthorne's smile. Not wicked, not careless, but hopeful. Hope, Miss Marple reflected, was often the most dangerous thing of all, and in St. Briarwood in the Meadows the final act of the tragedy had been written long before anyone thought the story had begun. Chapter 8. The Weight of Knowing. The revelation in Arthur Hawthorne's study did not spread through St. Briarwood in the Meadows, nor was it ever meant to. Truth, Miss Marple reflected, often arrived with far less ceremony than lies. Lies were dramatic, contagious. Truth preferred to sit quietly, waiting to be acknowledged. Inspector Keen sealed the letters in an evidence envelope that evening, then placed them carefully in his briefcase. His expression was grave, not with triumph, but with the burden of comprehension. This changes everything, he said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. And nothing. Keen gave her a sidelong look. That sounds like one of your riddles. It isn't, she said gently. Arthur Hawthorne's guilt will never be tried in court. Thomas and Lionel Drew will be. The village will have its villains, but the shape of what happened, how control poisons people long before it kills them, that will remain. The inspector nodded slowly. And Elspeth? Miss Marple paused before answering. Elspeth Hawthorne believed she had finally escaped. That belief was her smile. The following morning, Diana Hawthorne requested another meeting. She arrived pale but composed, dressed in mourning that looked heavier now, more sincere. They've told me Thomas and Lionel will stand trial, she said, and that Elspeth poisoned my father. Yes, Miss Marple said. That is what the world will say. Diana hesitated. And what do you say? Miss Marple studied her carefully. Diana's eyes held grief now, but also something sturdier. Clarity. I say, Miss Marple replied, that your father built a house of fear, and everyone inside learned to live by its rules. Some became cruel, some became desperate. None were untouched. Diana swallowed. I spent years thinking I was weak. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Surviving does not require strength in the way people imagine. It requires patience, Diana stood. I'm leaving St. Briarwood. Yes, Miss Marple said. That would be wise. As Diana left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. Only after several rows did she realize her stitches were too tight. She loosened them deliberately. Elsewhere in the village, the narrative simplified itself. Thomas became the embodiment of quiet resentment turned deadly. Lionel Drew, the greedy accomplice. Elspeth Hawthorne, the ambitious wife who poisoned her husband and paid the price. Arthur Hawthorne was remembered kindly. Miss Marple, passing the oak tree one afternoon, paused again before the plaque. Fresh flowers had been laid there. People prefer tidy memorials, she murmured. They're easier to live with. Inspector Keen came to say his farewell 2 days later. His aunt's visit had ended, and with it his official reason to linger. I've learned more here than I expected, he said, shaking Miss Marple's hand. So have I, she replied, which is always a little alarming. He hesitated. Do you ever regret knowing these things? Miss Marple considered. No, she said. But I regret that people so rarely stop others like Arthur Hawthorne before they learn how to ruin lives. As his car disappeared down the lane, the village resumed its rhythms. The shop bell rang. Children laughed. Tea was poured. And yet something had shifted. Mrs. Lavender Pritchard spoke less confidently now. Mrs. Keats gave notice quietly and went to live with her sister. The garden at Hawthorne House grew wild, no one quite willing to impose order upon it again. Miss Marple tended her own garden carefully. She planted foxglove that autumn, Not near the path, but at the far edge, where it could be admired without danger. Beauty, she believed, need not be denied because it carried risk. It only required understanding. As she pressed soil around the roots, she reflected on Arthur Hawthorne's final cruelty. The belief that even in death he could dictate outcomes. He had been wrong. Because one thing Arthur Hawthorne had never accounted for was an elderly woman with knitting needles, sharp eyes, and an unwavering faith in human patterns. Miss Marple straightened, brushed her gloves clean, and looked across St. Briarwood in the meadows. The story was not yet finished, but it was nearing its proper end. Chapter 9. Whispers and Footsteps. By mid-October, St. Briarwood in the meadows had settled into a deceptive calm. The leaves were turning amber and gold, the hedgerows bristled with early frost, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke from hearths long unused during the summer. Villagers went about their routines, smiling politely at one another while carefully avoiding the subject of the Hawthorns. Miss Marple, however, noticed every deviation from normalcy. The quiet walk of a child returning from school, the subtle hesitation in a shopkeeper's greeting, the sound of footsteps that were just slightly too measured. All of these were threads in a tapestry that the casual eye missed. She walked along the lane near the old oak tree, her knitting basket swinging gently at her side when she observed the first subtle anomaly. Across the green, Diana Hawthorne was speaking with Mrs. Keats in hushed tones. Both women froze as Miss Marple approached. Diana's face, once pale, now carried a faint colour. She smiled awkwardly. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her tone careful. "Good morning, dear," Miss Marple replied, her eyes sweeping the two of them. "A fine day for walking, or for observing what others do not." The women exchanged a glance that suggested unease. Diana excused herself, leaving Mrs. Keats behind. "Something troubling, Mrs. Keats?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Keats wrung her hands, her eyes darting nervously. I don't know what to think any more," she admitted, "even after everything." Miss Marple nodded. People often hold on to what they believe is true, even when they know it is not the whole truth. Before Mrs. Keats could respond, a distant voice called from the village square. It was Inspector Keene, returning unexpectedly. He strode toward Miss Marple with brisk steps. "Jane," he said, catching his breath, "we have a complication." Miss Marple inclined her head, curious. "There's been a break-in at the vicarage," he said. "Nothing was stolen, except for a ledger, some correspondence, and a small sealed envelope addressed to the late Mrs. Hawthorne." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked sharply. "Interesting," she said. "Someone is very concerned with what others should and should not know." Keene frowned. "I can't determine a motive yet. The vicar is upset, of course, but it seems personal, deliberate." Miss Marple looked down the lane toward Hawthorne House. "Deliberate indeed, and with careful intent. Whoever did this understands the value of information." The inspector shook his head. "It's too precise, too neat. I've seen cases like this before, but never with such elegance." Miss Marple tapped her knitting basket. "Ah, Harold. Elegance often hides malice, but it also leaves patterns if you know where to look." The two of them walked toward the vicarage together. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, noting details as they went. Footprints slightly displaced from the garden path, the faint scent of tobacco lingering in the air, a corner of lace caught in the hedgerow. Each small observation, seemingly insignificant, formed a lattice of understanding that would later prove essential. Inside the vicarage, the scene was orderly, almost too orderly. Nothing else appeared missing. The vicar, a small man with nervous hands, wrung his hat in agitation. "Who would do such a thing?" he asked, wringing his hands. "There's nothing of value here." "Value," Miss Marple said gently, "is not always measured in money, Reverend. Sometimes it is measured in secrets." Keene picked up the envelope. It had not been opened. Miss Marple examined it, noting the careful handwriting and the faint impression of a seal. "Someone wanted to see this destroyed, or redirected," she said quietly. "And they did it carefully," Keene agreed. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the vicar's study. Yes, very carefully, but in their care they left clues. A pattern emerges if one simply observes without panic. Outside, the village continued its routines, oblivious to the subtle stirrings of intrigue that had begun to coil once more. Miss Marple, knitting needles poised, allowed herself a small smile. The story of the Hawthorns was far from complete. And now the game had grown more complex. She could almost hear it, the whispers and footsteps, the careful steps of someone who believed their plan was perfect. But perfection, as Miss Marple had learned long ago, was always an illusion, and in St. Briarwood in the Meadows, illusions were about to unravel. Chapter 10. Shadows Among the Roses. The following morning brought a crispness to St. Briarwood in the Meadows, as if the very air had sensed the tension that lingered unseen among its cottages and gardens. The villagers moved about cautiously, their conversations peppered with sidelong glances and hushed tones. Even the postman seemed to linger at doorways, waiting for signs that the storm, whatever form it might take, had passed. Miss Marple, however, walked the lane to Hawthorne House with deliberate calm. She noted details others would dismiss, the slight bend in a gate hinge, a disturbed patch of earth near the rose garden, the way shadows pooled along the gravel paths. Observing, thinking, connecting. This was how she understood human behaviour, and today it whispered of fresh unease. Inside Hawthorne House, the household was in unusual motion. Diana Hawthorne moved between rooms with purposeful efficiency, while Mrs. Keats appeared tense, flitting from one task to another with eyes that betrayed worry beneath their habitual composure. Miss Marple observed them silently in the drawing-room. So much care for appearances, she murmured to herself, and yet fear cannot be so easily hidden. Diana looked up. Miss Marple, it's difficult to feel safe in a place like this, even with Thomas and Lionel removed. I cannot shake the feeling that someone is still watching, waiting. Miss Marple nodded, folding her knitting neatly. Often, dear, it is not the obvious danger that matters. It is the unseen one, the quiet shadow that moves unnoticed while everyone else assumes they are alone. At that moment the door opened, and a note was delivered. It was slipped under the door of the drawing-room, sealed with plain wax, bearing no name. Miss Marple picked it up and unfolded the paper. You see too much, Miss Marple. Stop watching, or the next tragedy will not be so easily explained. The room seemed suddenly colder. Diana gasped, and Mrs. Keats drew herself up stiffly. Miss Marple read the note carefully, her calm never faltering. Ah, she said quietly, a threat wrapped in civility. How thoughtful of them. Inspector Keene, who had been called in to discuss the recent vicarage break-in, examined the note. Well written, he admitted, but faintly ridiculous. Threats rarely are, Miss Marple said. They are designed for the mind as much as the body, to unsettle, to distract. And yet, she added, a faint smile appearing at the corners of her lips, they also tell us something about the writer. Pride, impatience, perhaps a belief in superiority. Diana's hands trembled slightly. Do you think it's someone we know? Miss Marple studied the room. Oh, without a doubt. Outsiders rarely understand the subtleties of a household like this. Those who live here know how to strike without leaving a mark, at least until now. The afternoon brought more visitors to Hawthorne House, each carrying their own quiet curiosity. Gwen Alder, the village librarian, brought a basket of books. Mrs. Lavender Pritchard came, ostensibly to discuss flower arrangements, but lingered, offering opinions that were sharper than necessary. Each time Miss Marple watched, noting gestures and expressions that contradicted words, half-hidden glances and carefully placed pauses. It was near the rose garden, as the sun fell lower, that Miss Marple noticed what she had been waiting for, a faint set of footprints, partially hidden by fallen leaves, leading from the greenhouse toward the back wall. The path was indirect, hesitant, as though the walker had paused to ensure no one was watching. Miss Marple bent to inspect the soil. The footprints were small, delicate, yet firm in intention. A woman, perhaps, or someone accustomed to moving lightly, deliberately, through unnoticed spaces. She stood, her sharp eyes following the trail. Something else caught her attention. A single foxglove petal, crushed beneath the edge of a shoe print. She picked it up carefully, tucking it into her handkerchief. Thomas and Lionel are no longer the threat, she murmured, but danger has a way of finding those who believe themselves safe. The question is, who and why? Inside the house, Diana Hawthorne paced restlessly. I can't stay here, she admitted. Even with the others gone, I feel observed. Miss Marple rested a comforting hand on her arm. The first step is to watch more closely, not to flee. People reveal themselves in small, repeated ways, and patience, dear, is often the greatest advantage. The shadows lengthened across the rose garden, and for the first time in days Miss Marple felt the faint thrill of anticipation. The pattern was emerging, subtle yet undeniable. Someone among them had a purpose, a secret to protect, and a willingness to use fear as a tool. And Miss Marple, with her quiet understanding of human nature, was determined to follow the trail to its source. The game, she knew, had entered a new and dangerous phase. The next move, she suspected, would reveal more than anyone expected. Chapter 11. Secrets in Plain Sight. The morning after the discovery of the threatening note, St. Briarwood in the Meadows seemed even quieter than usual. The villagers moved cautiously, speaking only when necessary, as if the air itself carried the weight of something unseen. Miss Marple walked her usual path along the lane, basket in hand, and noticed subtleties that others ignored. A shutter left slightly ajar, a faint disturbance in the gravel at the edge of a path, a curtain twitching without cause. Inside Hawthorne House, Diana Hawthorne had begun taking measures of her own. Windows were checked, doors locked multiple times, and the garden, usually left to grow wild after Arthur Hawthorne's death, was now patrolled meticulously. Yet, even with precautions, the feeling of being watched lingered. Miss Marple observed quietly from the drawing-room, her knitting laid aside. "Fear," she murmured, "is not in locks or bolts. It is in the mind." Inspector Keene arrived mid-morning, carrying the latest reports from the vicarage and the post office. The ledger stolen in the break-in had been partially recovered, though some pages were missing, torn with care and precision. "Someone is very careful," Keene said, "and very clever." Miss Marple nodded. "Cleverness is not always the same as wisdom. It is the persistent misuse of opportunity." Diana approached, her expression tight. "Miss Marple, do you really think someone in the village is capable of this?" "Not merely capable, dear," Miss Marple said, "but accustomed to observation. The quiet ones often see everything while speaking little, or nothing at all." The afternoon was punctuated by a series of minor, almost imperceptible events. The sound of a window shutting when no one was near, a misplaced envelope left on a side table, and the faint scent of tobacco, though no smoker had entered the house in days. Each, Miss Marple noted, was deliberately calculated to unsettle. Later, as she walked the garden alone, Miss Marple noticed something odd near the greenhouse. A slight indentation in the soil, partially covered by fallen leaves, and beside it a foxglove stalk broken cleanly at the stem. She knelt to examine it. The pattern of disturbance suggested someone moving with caution, aware of observation, but not paranoid. Returning indoors, she found Diana staring out a window. "I don't understand," Diana said. "Every precaution seems useless." Miss Marple placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "The person behind this does not rely on force. They rely on subtlety, and subtlety leaves traces if you are patient enough to notice." By evening, Miss Marple had pieced together a mental map of the day's anomalies. The footprints, the broken foxglove, the missing pages, they were all part of a sequence. Someone was testing, measuring reactions, gauging fear, and ensuring that attention was diverted elsewhere. As dusk fell, the village square grew empty, save for the occasional passer-by hurrying home. Miss Marple lingered, quietly noting lights in windows, movements of curtains and shadows that fell too deliberately. Her mind returned to the small foxglove petal she had picked up earlier. It was a signal, perhaps unintentional, left by someone who moved carefully, but could not resist leaving evidence. "Yes," she whispered to herself. "The pattern is clear. The next move will not be hidden." She returned to the house where Diana and Inspector Keene awaited, unaware that the real observer had already begun to see the story unfold in full. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "It is time," she said quietly, "to watch and wait. The person who believes themselves invisible will reveal themselves soon enough." Outside, the shadows lengthened across the gardens, and the quiet of St. Briarwood in the Meadows deepened. The village, unaware of how close the final revelations were, slept uneasily under the weight of secrets that had yet to speak. And Miss Marple, patient as ever, knew that within these shadows the truth waited, ready to be uncovered. Chapter 12. The Unseen Hand. The next morning brought a fog that clung to St. Briarwood in the Meadows like a shroud. The village seemed smaller, quieter, as though the mist had swallowed its usual energy. Miss Marple, walking along the familiar lanes with her knitting basket swinging lightly at her side, found herself noting subtleties in the fog, a bootprint that led nowhere, a sudden scuff on a doorstep, and the faint scent of tobacco that seemed to appear and vanish without source. Inside Hawthorne House, Diana Hawthorne moved about with careful deliberation, her earlier panic tempered into vigilance. She checked the locks on the doors twice, peered behind curtains, and even glanced suspiciously at Mrs. Keats, who, though loyal, now seemed to her like a potential observer. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the drawing-room with her knitting abandoned, observed the household with the calm of someone who understood the rhythms of anxiety. "The person behind these threats," she murmured, "is not in a hurry. They prefer patience, subtlety, and careful orchestration. One mistake and the entire design collapses." Inspector Keene arrived mid-morning, his expression grave. "Miss Marple," he said, holding a small notebook, "we've received reports of unusual activity near the Hawthorne estate. Footsteps, shadows moving between the gardens. No one sees the intruder clearly, but signs indicate someone has been watching even during the night." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Not watching carelessly, Harold, but deliberately. Whoever it is, they know exactly where to step and how to remain unseen. Fear is their ally, observation their instrument." Diana approached, her hands twisting nervously. "Do you think this is someone from the village?" "Almost certainly," Miss Marple replied. "An outsider would be clumsy. These movements, calculated, subtle, belong to someone who knows the routines, who has studied them for weeks, perhaps months." The afternoon passed with small, almost imperceptible disturbances. A faintly displaced chair, a window left slightly ajar, and a garden gate that had been moved. Each act was too precise to be accidental, and yet too quiet to be threatening outright. Miss Marple took note of every detail. She examined the footprints in the softened soil near the greenhouse, comparing size, stride, and depth. She noted the careful handling of objects inside the house, and the way shadows shifted across walls, seemingly without source. Later, as the sun lowered toward the horizon, Miss Marple and Inspector Keene walked the garden together. "Every movement," she said, "tells a story. Every leaf turned, every stone displaced is part of a deliberate pattern. The person who orchestrated the Hawthorne deaths is watching the aftermath, seeing how fear spreads, who notices, who panics." Keene shivered slightly. "It feels unnerving, like being prey, but unaware of the predator." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Exactly. And that is the power of subtlety. Those who act quietly often see the most, but all quietness leaves a trace, if one knows where to look." Returning indoors, Miss Marple discovered a small scrap of paper tucked behind a book on the lower shelf of the study. It bore a single word hastily written: "Watch." "Ah," she murmured, lifting it carefully. "Confirmation. The unseen hand has revealed itself, just enough to hint, but not enough to be caught. Clever, very clever." Diana entered the room, noticing Miss Marple holding the scrap. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means," Miss Marple replied gently, "that the next move is deliberate. The person believes themselves invisible, untouchable. But every shadow, every whisper leaves a mark, and I intend to follow it." Outside, the fog thickened as evening approached. The village remained unaware that the invisible hand had already begun to guide events once more, shaping fear and anticipation, waiting for the moment to act decisively. And Miss Marple, patient and perceptive, knew that the web of secrets was nearly complete. All that remained was for the final strand to be pulled, revealing the truth hidden in plain sight.